Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we explore the ancient Celtic realm where Cernunnos, the magnificent horned god, watches over wild forests and sacred groves. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Close your eyes now, and let the weight of the modern world slip away from your shoulders like autumn leaves falling to the forest floor. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, deeper into stillness, as we prepare to journey back through the mists of time to an age when the boundary between our world and the realm of the gods was as thin as morning fog. Tonight, we walk the ancient paths of the Celts, where mighty oaks stood sentinel over sacred groves, and the very stones hummed with magic older than memory. We seek the presence of one whose name has echoed through centuries, whose antlered crown has cast shadows across the dreams of countless generations. Cernunnos, the horned god, lord of the wild, guardian of the sacred grove. In the deep places of the earth, where roots intertwine with forgotten bones, where the first druids carved their wisdom into living wood, his presence still stirs. He who sits cross-legged in eternal meditation, antlers reaching toward the stars, serpent coiled at his feet, torques of gold gleaming in his hands. Let your breathing slow now, each exhale carrying you further from the concerns of today, each inhale drawing you closer to the sacred mysteries. The ancient Celts knew that to understand their gods, one must first understand the wild heart that beats within all living things. Tonight, we shall discover that heart, and in doing so, perhaps touch something eternal within ourselves. In the beginning, before the Romans carved their roads through Celtic lands, before the Druids raised the first stone circles, before even the oldest trees took root in the sacred groves, there was the wild. Not wild as we understand it today, not the absence of civilization, but something far more profound. The wild was the first breath of creation, the heartbeat that set all rhythms of nature in motion, the consciousness that dwelt in every living thing from the mightiest oak to the smallest field mouse. And at the heart of this wild sat a figure both ancient and eternal, cross-legged upon the earth, his back against the world tree, his antlers reaching toward the infinite sky. The Celts would come to know him by many names across their scattered tribes and kingdoms. The Gauls called him Cernunnos, from the ancient words meaning horned one. The Irish spoke of him as the Dagda in his aspect as lord of animals, while the Welsh remembered him in their tales of Herne the Hunter and the horned king of the otherworld. But names are merely the clothes that mortals wrap around divine mysteries, and this god was far older than any human tongue that spoke them. Archaeological evidence speaks to us across millennia, whispering his story through artifacts buried in the earth like seeds waiting for the right season to bloom. In Val Camonica, Italy, petroglyphs dating back to the 7th century BCE show a figure with antlers, arms outstretched, surrounded by animals. In Denmark, the silver Gundestrup cauldron, crafted in the 2nd or 1st century BCE, displays him in exquisite detail, seated in lotus position, one hand grasping a serpent, the other holding a golden torque. These images tell us that Cernunnos was not merely a local deity of a single tribe or region, but a presence that stretched across the Celtic world from Ireland to Anatolia, from Scotland to Spain. Wherever Celtic peoples settled, wherever they encountered the deep forests and wild places of the earth, there they found him waiting. Not as a stranger to be feared, but as an ancient friend who had been expecting their arrival. The earliest Celtic peoples understood something that we have largely forgotten in our modern age. They knew that divinity was not separate from nature, not dwelling in distant heavens removed from earthly concerns, but intimately present in every aspect of the natural world. The gods breathed in the wind through the trees, spoke in the language of bird calls, and walked among them in the forms of stag and boar, wolf and raven. And chief among these divine presences was the horned god, who embodied not just individual animals, but the very principle of wildness itself. To the ancient Celts, antlers were not merely bone projections from an animal's skull, but living symbols of the life force that eternally dies and is reborn. Each autumn, the great stags would shed their antlers, leaving them crowned with bare pedicles like ancient kings stripped of their regalia. Through the dark months of winter, they would remain thus humbled, walking the forest paths with heads held low. But with the return of spring, the antlers would begin to grow again, soft at first and covered with velvet, then hardening into bone as summer progressed, becoming magnificent crowns that caught the light like polished bronze. This cycle of death and rebirth, loss and renewal, spoke to something deep in the Celtic soul. They saw in it the fundamental pattern that governed all existence, the eternal wheel of life that turned through seasons of light and dark, growth and decay, joy and sorrow. And Cernunnos, with his great branching antlers, was the living embodiment of this principle. He was both the dying god who descended into the underworld each winter, and the reborn god who emerged triumphant with the spring. He was both the hunter and the hunted, the giver of life and the dealer of death, the guardian of the boundaries between the world of humans and the realm of the spirits. But to understand Cernunnos fully, we must first understand the world in which he was worshipped. The Celtic lands were places of deep magic, where the visible and invisible worlds interpenetrated like streams flowing together in a sacred confluence. Every hill had its genius loci, its indwelling spirit. Every grove had its dryad. Every spring had its nymph. The landscape itself was alive, conscious, aware, capable of blessing those who approached it with proper reverence and cursing those who treated it with disrespect. In this enchanted world, the Druids served as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. They were priests, judges, teachers, healers, and keepers of ancient wisdom. They spent 20 years or more in training, memorizing vast bodies of oral tradition that included not only religious practices and mythological stories, but also laws, histories, astronomical observations, and practical knowledge of herbs and healing. They alone possessed the authority to interpret the will of the gods and to perform the sacred rituals that maintained the balance between the worlds. And among all the gods they served, none was more central to their practice than Cernunnos. For he was the god of the liminal spaces, the in-between places where transformation occurred. He ruled over the twilight hours when day became night, the threshold moments when autumn turned to winter, the sacred groves where the human world touched the other world. He was present at births and deaths, at the initiations of young druids, at the seasonal festivals when the communities gathered to honor the turning of the year. The druids taught that Cernunnos possessed many aspects, like facets of a great gemstone that revealed different colors depending on how the light struck it. In his role as Lord of Animals, he was the patron of hunters and herders, the one who decided which animals could be taken for food and which must be left to breed and multiply. A successful hunt required his blessing, and no wise hunter would venture into the deep forest without first making proper offerings at his shrine. But he was also the protector of the animals, and those who hunted without respect, who killed for sport rather than need, or who took more than their fair share would find their arrows flying wide and their traps empty. In his aspect as god of fertility and abundance, Cernunnos governed not only the mating of animals but the fertility of the land itself. The ancient Celts understood that human fertility was intimately connected to the fertility of the earth, that the success of crops and herds depended on maintaining proper relationships with the divine forces of nature. Spring festivals in his honor often included rituals of sympathetic magic designed to encourage the growth of crops and the increase of livestock. Young couples would make love in newly plowed fields under his auspices, believing that their passion would transfer to the seeds sleeping in the earth. But perhaps most importantly, Cernunnos was the guardian of wisdom, the keeper of the deep knowledge that could only be gained through direct communion with the natural world. The Druids taught that true wisdom could not be learned from books or teachers alone, but must be discovered through patient observation of natural cycles, through meditation in wild places, through opening oneself to the teachings that came from the wind and the rain, the movements of animals, and the subtle energies that flowed through the earth. Cernunnos was the guide who could lead seekers to this deeper understanding, but only if they approached him with humility and genuine desire for truth. The image of Cernunnos that has come down to us through archaeological evidence is rich with symbolism, each element carrying layers of meaning that the ancient Celts would have understood intuitively. To decode these symbols is to unlock a window into a worldview that saw divinity not as abstract theological concepts, but as living forces that could be encountered and experienced directly. The most immediately striking feature of Cernunnos is, of course, his antlers. These are not the simple horns of a goat or bull, but the complex, branching antlers of a mature stag, often depicted with 7 or more points reaching toward the sky like a living crown. In Celtic symbolism, antlers represented far more than mere animal attributes. They were the connection between earth and sky, roots and branches, the underworld and the heavens. Each point of the antler was said to correspond to one of the sacred directions, not just the 4 cardinal points known to us, but the full compass of Celtic sacred geography: north, south, east, west, above, below, and the center that contained all others. The antlers also symbolized the tree of life, that cosmic axis around which all existence revolved. In Celtic cosmology, this great tree had its roots in the underworld, its trunk in the middle world where humans dwelt, and its crown in the celestial realm of the gods. By wearing antlers, Cernunnos declared himself to be the living embodiment of this cosmic principle, the point where all worlds met and all energies converged. But antlers carried another meaning that was perhaps even more profound. Unlike horns, which grow continuously throughout an animal's life, antlers follow the cycle of death and rebirth, falling away each winter and growing anew each spring. This made them perfect symbols of regeneration, of the eternal principle that life emerges from death, that endings are always beginnings in disguise. The Celtic peoples, living close to the rhythms of nature, understood this principle intimately. They saw it in the way seeds died in the earth to give birth to new plants, in the way the sun died each evening only to be reborn at dawn, in the way their loved ones died only to be reborn in the other world. In the famous Gundestrup cauldron, Cernunnos is shown seated in what scholars call the Buddha position, though this cross-legged meditation posture was known to the Celts long before Buddhism reached European shores. This position indicates his role as the divine meditator, the god who sits in eternal contemplation at the center of existence, maintaining the balance of all forces through the power of his focused consciousness. This was not passive meditation, but active participation in the cosmic process, the god's awareness serving as the stable point around which all change could safely occur. But in his left hand, he holds a serpent, that ancient symbol of the untamed natural world, of the chthonic forces that rise from the depths of the earth, of wisdom that comes not from human learning but from direct contact with the primal energies of existence. The serpent, like the antlers, was a symbol of regeneration, for snakes shed their skins as they grew, apparently dying and being reborn in endless cycles. But the serpent also represented the Kundalini force, the serpent power that the Druids knew could be awakened through proper ritual practice, rising from the base of the spine to the crown of the head, transforming the practitioner into a conduit for divine energy. The juxtaposition of torque and serpent in Cernunnos' hands revealed one of the most important aspects of his nature. He was not simply a god of wild places, opposing civilization and calling people back to a purely animal existence. Rather, he represented the integration of civilization and wildness, the understanding that true culture could only flourish when it remained connected to its natural roots. The torque without the serpent led to sterile formalism, to human societies that lost touch with the living forces that sustained them. The serpent without the torque led to chaos, to raw power without wisdom or direction. But together, they created the possibility of a sacred civilization, a way of life that honored both human achievement and natural law. Surrounding Cernunnos in many depictions are various animals, each carrying its own symbolic significance in Celtic lore. The stag, of course, represented nobility, grace, and the solar principle, the masculine energy that emerged victorious from the challenges of the dark season. The bull symbolized fertility, strength, and material abundance, the power that drove the agricultural cycles upon which Celtic communities depended. The ram, with its curling horns, represented the spiral of time, the way energy moved not in straight lines but in curves and circles, creating patterns of growth and decay that repeated endlessly but never exactly the same way twice. Dogs appear frequently in Cernunnos' imagery, and these were not merely hunting companions but psychopomps, guides who could travel between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Celtic mythology is filled with stories of supernatural hounds who served the gods, leading souls to their proper destinations in the afterlife, warning mortals of approaching danger, or appearing as omens of significant events. The presence of dogs with Cernunnos indicated his role as a guide between worlds, a god who could lead seekers safely through the dangerous passages that connected ordinary reality with the deeper mysteries. Boars also appear in Cernunnos' iconography, and these fierce creatures held special significance for Celtic warriors. The boar was the animal of the warrior class, representing courage, ferocity in battle, and the willingness to fight to the death for one's tribe and honor. But boars were also associated with the wisdom that comes through ordeal, the knowledge that can only be gained by facing one's deepest fears and emerging transformed. Celtic initiation rituals often involved symbolic encounters with boars, tests of courage that prepared young people for the challenges of adult life. Ravens and crows frequently appear in Celtic art associated with Cernunnos, and these birds of ill omen were actually regarded as messengers of the gods, creatures capable of flying between the worlds and bringing back news from the otherworld. The Celts believed that ravens possessed prophetic abilities, that they could see the threads of fate that connected past, present, and future. A raven perched on Cernunnos' shoulder indicated that he possessed comprehensive knowledge not just of what was, but of what had been and what was yet to come. But perhaps the most mysterious of the animals associated with Cernunnos was the salmon, that creature which spent part of its life in the sea and part in fresh water, which could navigate vast oceanic distances to return to the exact stream where it had been born. To the Celts, salmon represented the soul's journey between incarnations, the ability to find one's way home to the source despite having traveled through many lifetimes and many worlds. Salmon also symbolized wisdom gained through experience, for these fish had to overcome tremendous obstacles in their journey upstream, fighting against powerful currents, leaping up waterfalls, persisting despite exhaustion until they reached their spawning grounds. The sacred trees that appear in Cernunnos' imagery carry their own rich symbolism. The oak, most sacred of all trees to the Druids, represented strength, endurance, and the axis that connected all worlds. Druids conducted their most important rituals in oak groves, believing that these trees served as natural temples where the gods could be most easily contacted. The mistletoe that grew on oak trees was considered especially sacred, a plant that belonged neither to earth nor sky but existed in the liminal space between them. Deep in the heart of the primeval forests that once covered much of Europe, where sunlight filtered through layers of leaves to create a green cathedral of living columns, Cernunnos held court as the undisputed lord of beasts. This was not dominion as humans understand it, not the ownership that seeks to control and exploit, but the sacred kingship of one who serves by leading, who rules by understanding the needs of all subjects, both great and small. In the ancient Celtic understanding, every animal possessed its own spirit, its own consciousness, its own sacred purpose in the great web of existence. The mighty aurochs, ancestor of domestic cattle, carried the force of solar energy in its powerful frame and represented the wealth of the tribe in its flesh and milk and hide. The wild boar, tusks gleaming in the forest shadows, embodied the warrior's courage and the fierce protection of family and territory. The red deer, graceful and alert, held the wisdom of the feminine mysteries and the secrets of forest pathways known only to the initiated. But individual animals were more than isolated beings pursuing their separate destinies. They were part of a vast, interconnected community that extended beyond the physical realm into the spiritual dimensions of existence. Each species maintained its own relationship with the otherworld, its own ancestral wisdom passed down through generations not as learned knowledge but as instinctual understanding. Migratory birds carried messages between distant lands and different seasons. Wolves maintained the boundaries between the tamed and the wild. Bears, emerging from their winter caves, brought news from the underworld where they had communed with the spirits of the sleeping earth. Cernunnos understood the language that all these creatures spoke, not the vocal communications that humans could sometimes decode, but the deeper speech of energy and intention, of need and offering, of the intricate negotiations that maintained the balance between predator and prey, between competition and cooperation. He was the great translator, the divine interpreter who could hear the requests of the wolf pack and the fears of the deer herd, who could sense the territorial disputes between rival eagle pairs and the collaborative arrangements between different species that shared the same hunting grounds. The ancient Druids taught that Cernunnos appeared to different animals in different forms, adapting his manifestation to what each species could perceive and understand. To the great cats that once prowled European forests, he might appear as a magnificent lion with a mane of golden light, his presence both familiar and awesome. To the herds of wild horses that thundered across the steppes, he could manifest as the lead stallion, antlers temporarily transformed into a flowing mane that caught the wind like a battle standard. To the flocks of migrating geese, he might be seen as a great white bird whose wings spanned the sky, leading them safely across dangerous territories to their seasonal destinations. But perhaps his most complex relationship was with the wolves, those intelligent pack hunters who in many ways mirrored human social organization. The Celts recognized wolves as their spiritual kin, fellow hunters who understood the necessity of cooperation, who maintained elaborate social hierarchies, who cared for their young with tender devotion and defended their territory with implacable courage. Cernunnos appeared to wolf packs as the alpha of alphas, the great gray shadow who moved through moonlight with silent authority, whose howl could call all the wolves of the forest to assembly when matters of great importance required their collective wisdom. The relationship between Cernunnos and the wolves was more than simple dominion. It was a sacred partnership, a mutual recognition of shared purposes and complementary abilities. The wolves served as his messengers and scouts, ranging far across the landscape to bring him news of changes in the natural world. They could sense the approach of severe weather days before it arrived, could detect the movements of large herds from distances that would be impossible for human observers, could identify individual creatures by scent trails that might be weeks old. In return, Cernunnos guided them to the best hunting grounds, warned them away from areas where human hunters waited in ambush, and blessed their pups with the intelligence and strength they would need to survive in an increasingly dangerous world. The bond between the horned god and the great bears was different but equally profound. Bears were solitary creatures for the most part, coming together only briefly for mating before returning to their individual territories. But they possessed a kind of ancient wisdom that even the wolves respected, a deep knowledge of the earth's rhythms and the secrets hidden in caves and underground chambers. To the Celts, bears were living symbols of the earth's fertility and the mysteries of death and rebirth. Each autumn, bears would disappear into caves and hollow trees, entering a state that was neither true sleep nor death but something in between. Throughout the winter months, they remained in this liminal condition, their breathing slowed almost to stopping, their body temperature dropped, their awareness turned inward to commune with dreams and visions that came from the deepest levels of consciousness. And in this death-like sleep, female bears gave birth to cubs, bringing new life into the world during the season when most other animals simply struggled to survive. Then, with the return of spring, they emerged from their winter caves like spirits returning from the underworld, lean and hungry but possessing knowledge that could only be gained through direct communion with the forces of dissolution and regeneration. Cernunnos honored the bears as his philosophers and mystics, the contemplatives of the animal world who understood truths that could only be learned through solitude and deep introspection. He appeared to them in their cave sanctuaries during their winter journeys, sometimes taking the form of a great bear himself, sometimes manifesting as the antlered figure seated in lotus position, teaching them through dreams and visions the secrets of the turning seasons and the hidden connections between all living things. The relationship between Cernunnos and the birds was perhaps the most complex of all, for the avian realm encompassed such a vast range of species and habitats that no single form of interaction could address them all. The great raptors, eagles, hawks, falcons served as his eyes in the sky, soaring high above the forest canopy to survey vast territories and report on conditions that ground-dwelling creatures could not observe. These aerial scouts could spot forest fires while they were still small enough to contain, could track the movements of migrating herds across hundreds of miles, could identify threats approaching from distant territories long before they posed immediate danger. The smaller songbirds formed a different kind of network, a vast communication system that could relay messages across the landscape faster than any human messenger could travel. Each species had its own role in this natural telegraph system. Robins announced the dawn and gave the all-clear after predators had passed. Wrens served as sentries, their alarm calls alerting entire forest communities to the approach of danger. Crows and ravens, with their remarkable intelligence and long memories, served as historians and record-keepers, remembering significant events and passing the knowledge down through generations of their kind. But it was with the great owls that Cernunnos shared perhaps his most intimate connection. These nocturnal hunters moved through darkness with supernatural silence, their keen hearing able to detect the movement of small prey beneath snow or fallen leaves, their night vision revealing details of the landscape that remained hidden from diurnal eyes. Owls were the psychopomps of the bird world, guides who could navigate between the realm of the living and the land of the dead, messengers who could carry communications between this world and the other world. When Cernunnos needed to send urgent messages to the spirits of the ancestral realm, He dispatched the great eagle owls, whose haunting calls could be heard across vast distances and whose presence was recognized by all creatures as a sign that momentous events were approaching. The aquatic animals that lived in the rivers, lakes, and coastal waters also fell under Cernunnos' protection, though his relationship with them required different forms of manifestation. To the salmon, those heroic fish that undertook epic journeys between salt and fresh water, he appeared as a great silver fish with antlers of living light, leading them through the most treacherous passages of their migration routes. The ancient Celts revered salmon as symbols of wisdom gained through experience, creatures who could navigate vast distances through trackless oceans yet always find their way back to the exact stream where they had been born. Otters, those playful spirits of the waterways, served as Cernunnos' jesters and messengers, carrying communications between different watersheds and bringing news of conditions upstream and downstream. Their intelligence and adaptability made them ideal intermediaries between the terrestrial and aquatic realms, equally at home on land or in water, equally skilled at hunting fish or catching rabbits. Celtic folklore preserved many stories of otters who served as guides for human travelers, leading them to safe river crossings or warning them away from dangerous currents and hidden obstacles. The beavers held a special place in Cernunnos' kingdom as the engineers and architects of the waterways. These industrious creatures possessed the ability to reshape entire landscapes through their dam-building activities, creating wetlands that supported countless other species, moderating flood cycles, and maintaining the health of watershed systems across vast regions. Cernunnos honored them as co-creators, fellow shapers of the environment who understood the importance of working with natural forces rather than opposing them. Their patience and persistence in building their elaborate structures served as lessons for human communities about the rewards that came from long-term thinking and cooperative effort. But perhaps most mysterious of all were Cernunnos' relationships with the creatures that existed at the boundaries between different realms of existence. Bats, those mammals who had taken to the air, bridged the gap between earth and sky, between the world of four-legged creatures and the realm of winged beings. Their ability to navigate through complete darkness using sound rather than sight made them natural symbols of those forms of knowledge that could only be gained through senses other than ordinary vision. Cernunnos appeared to them as a great bat with antlers, teaching them the secret pathways through the night sky and the hidden connections between caves and caverns that honeycomb the earth. In the deepest heart of every ancient forest stood a grove unlike any other, a circle of trees so old that their first leaves had unfurled when the world was young. Here, where shafts of golden sunlight pierced the green cathedral of interwoven branches, where the very air hummed with power accumulated over countless centuries, Cernunnos maintained his most sacred sanctuary. This was not merely a place of worship, but a living temple where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin as morning mist. The sacred grove was never the product of human planning or cultivation. It arose naturally, through the mysterious process by which certain places seemed to call to themselves the most perfect arrangement of trees and plants, the most harmonious blending of earth and water, light and shadow. Oak trees formed the outer circle, their massive trunks creating pillars more impressive than any human architecture, their gnarled roots extending deep into the earth to draw wisdom from the bones of the ancestors buried far below. Within this protective ring, ash trees reached toward the sky, their delicate leaves allowing filtered sunlight to create patterns of illumination that shifted and danced throughout the day. And at the very center grew a single tree unlike any other, sometimes described as an oak of impossible age and size, sometimes as a yew whose trunk had grown so massive that a dozen people joining hands could not encircle it. This central tree was the Axis Mundi, the world tree around which all existence revolved. Its roots descended to the deepest levels of the underworld, where they intertwined with the foundations of reality itself. Its trunk occupied the middle world, the realm where humans and animals lived their daily lives. Its crown reached into the celestial realm, where its highest branches touched the homes of the gods and supported the vault of the star-filled sky. And seated at its base, his back against its ancient bark, his antlered crown reaching toward its lowest branches, sat Cernunnos in eternal meditation. In the visible realm, the grove teemed with life of every kind. Ancient trees hosted communities of birds whose ancestors had nested in the same branches for generations beyond counting. Rare flowers bloomed in hidden clearings, their petals holding colors that seemed to capture and concentrate the essence of sunlight itself. Springs of crystal-clear water bubbled up from mysterious sources deep underground, their waters said to possess healing properties and the ability to grant visions to those who drank with proper reverence. Animals moved through the grove with unusual fearlessness, as though they recognized it as a place of sanctuary where the ordinary rules of predator and prey were temporarily suspended. But in the spiritual dimensions, the grove became something far more wondrous and terrible. Here dwelt the collective consciousness of all the trees that had ever grown in Celtic lands, the accumulated wisdom of forests that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Here the spirits of legendary heroes came to consult with Cernunnos about matters affecting the balance between human ambition and natural law. Here the souls of druids who had died in service to their people continued their work, teaching younger initiates and maintaining the complex rituals that kept the boundaries between worlds intact. The approach to the sacred grove required specific preparations and permissions. No one could simply wander into this most holy of places as they might enter an ordinary forest clearing. The grove itself decided who would be permitted to find it, and many who searched for years never encountered even its outermost boundaries. Those who were called to approach the grove first experienced a series of signs and portents that served as both invitation and warning. The signs might begin subtly, with unusual encounters with animals that seemed to be observing the potential visitor with particular intelligence. A red deer might appear repeatedly along a certain forest path, always at the same distance, always watching with eyes that held too much awareness for an ordinary wild creature. Ravens might begin gathering wherever the person traveled, not threatening but clearly paying attention, as though reporting on movements to some unseen authority. Dreams would become more vivid and meaningful, filled with images of ancient forests and figures wearing crowns of antlers who spoke in languages the dreamer somehow understood despite never having heard them before. As the calling intensified, the signs became more dramatic and unmistakable. Plants would behave in unusual ways, flowers blooming out of season, trees dropping leaves in the shape of ancient symbols, mushroom rings appearing overnight in patterns that corresponded to stellar constellations. The very landscape seemed to shift and rearrange itself, with familiar paths leading to unexpected destinations and new tracks appearing that led deeper into the forest than geography should have allowed. Weather patterns would respond to the seeker's emotional state, with sudden mists rising when doubt or fear clouded the mind, or brilliant shafts of sunlight breaking through clouds to illuminate the correct direction when clarity and determination prevailed. Those who successfully followed these signs and indications eventually found themselves standing at the edge of the sacred grove, though they could rarely explain exactly how they had arrived there or retrace the route they had taken. The transition from ordinary forest to sacred space was marked by a change in the quality of light and air that was unmistakable once experienced. Colors became more saturated, sounds more resonant, and the very atmosphere seemed to thicken with accumulated power and presence. Many visitors described a sensation of being watched, not with suspicion or hostility, but with the benevolent attention of a wise parent observing a beloved child's first steps into a wider world. The grove itself enforced its own laws and customs through means that were gentle but absolute. Those who entered with impure motives or selfish intentions found themselves unable to proceed beyond the outer ring of oaks, as though invisible barriers prevented their forward movement. Those who came with weapons or thoughts of violence discovered that their implements became too heavy to carry, while aggressive emotions simply dissolved in the peaceful atmosphere of the sacred space. The grove seemed to evaluate each visitor's heart and mind, permitting access only to those whose intentions aligned with the principles of harmony and respect that governed this most holy of places. For those deemed worthy to enter, the grove revealed its wonders gradually, in accordance with their ability to perceive and understand. Novice visitors might see only an exceptionally beautiful forest clearing, perhaps noticing that the animals showed no fear of human presence and that the springs produced water of unusual clarity and refreshing properties. More experienced seekers would begin to perceive the subtle emanations of power that flowed through the grove like underground rivers, the network of energy lines that connected each tree to every other tree and extended outward to link this sacred space with other groves across the Celtic world. But at the heart of all these experiences was the presence of Cernunnos himself, seated in eternal meditation at the base of the world tree. To approach him required the ultimate surrender of ego and personal agenda, the willingness to stand naked in consciousness before a God whose awareness encompassed all of existence. Those who achieved this level of surrender found themselves in the presence of divinity made manifest, experiencing directly the consciousness that governed all natural processes and maintained the balance between order and chaos, growth and decay, life and death. In the presence of Cernunnos, ordinary human concerns fell away like discarded garments. The petty anxieties and ambitions that normally occupied the mind seemed insignificant compared to the vast rhythms and purposes that the horned god embodied. Visitors often described a profound sense of coming home, of remembering something essential about their own nature that they had forgotten in the complexity of civilized life. They understood, perhaps for the first time, their true place in the web of existence, not as separate beings struggling against an indifferent universe, but as integral parts of a living, conscious cosmos that welcomed their participation and honored their contributions. The teachings that Cernunnos imparted in the sacred grove were not abstract philosophical concepts but direct transmissions of understanding that altered the recipient's consciousness permanently. These teachings addressed the fundamental questions that had driven the seeker to find the grove in the first place: the meaning of existence, the purpose of suffering, the nature of death and rebirth, the relationship between individual will and cosmic law. But the answers came not as intellectual formulations but as lived experiences, as shifts in awareness that allowed the recipient to perceive reality from a divine perspective. The ancient Celts understood time not as a linear progression moving from past through present toward future, but as a great wheel that turned through endless cycles, each revolution bringing new opportunities for growth, learning, and transformation. At the hub of this eternal wheel sat Cernunnos, the still point around which all change revolved, the consciousness that experienced every season while remaining unchanged by any particular moment within the cycle. His antlers grew and were shed, his form shifted between youthful vigor and ancient wisdom, but his essential nature remained constant as the pole star around which the entire cosmos danced. The Celtic year was punctuated by 8 great festivals that marked the key transitions in this seasonal cycle, each one an opportunity for communities to realign themselves with the natural rhythms that governed all life. At each of these festivals, Cernunnos manifested in different aspects, revealing different facets of his divine nature as the year progressed from light to dark and back to light again. To understand these seasonal manifestations is to glimpse the profound wisdom that the ancient Celts possessed about the relationship between consciousness and the natural world. The year began with Samhain, the great festival that marked the transition from the light half of the year to the dark half, the time when the veil between worlds grew thin and the spirits of the ancestors could return to visit their living descendants. On this most sacred of nights, Cernunnos appeared in his aspect as Lord of the Dead, the psychopomp who guided souls between the realm of the living and the otherworld. His antlers at this season were those of an ancient stag, massive and many-pointed, crowned with the accumulated wisdom of countless lifetimes. His eyes held the depth of one who had witnessed the passing of ages, who had seen civilizations rise and fall like waves upon the shore of eternity. In this aspect, Cernunnos served as the guardian of the threshold between life and death, ensuring that the passage from one state to the other proceeded according to cosmic law rather than random chance. He determined which souls were ready to cross over completely into the otherworld and which still had lessons to learn in the realm of physical existence. He oversaw the complex negotiations between living and dead that occurred during the Samhain season, when ancestral spirits returned to offer guidance to their descendants, to resolve unfinished business from their earthly lives, or simply to maintain the bonds of love that transcended the boundaries of death. The festival of Samhain was marked by rituals that honored both the dying year and the approaching season of inner reflection. Great bonfires were lit on hilltops across the Celtic world, their flames serving as beacons to guide wandering spirits and as offerings to Cernunnos in his role as guardian of the dark season. Cattle were brought in from their summer pastures and examined to determine which animals would be kept through the winter and which would be slaughtered to provide food for the cold months ahead. This practical necessity was transformed into a sacred ritual through the understanding that death and service to the community was itself a form of divine offering, and that the spirits of the slaughtered animals would return in the spring to inhabit new bodies born from the herds they had helped to sustain. As the wheel turned toward Yule, the winter solstice that marked the longest night and the return of the growing light, Cernunnos underwent a profound transformation. His aspect as Lord of the Dead gradually gave way to his manifestation as the dying and rising God, the divine sacrifice whose death ensured the continuation of life, whose resurrection promised renewal for all existence. At the moment of the solstice, when the sun reached its lowest point in the sky and began its journey back toward spring, Cernunnos was reborn as the child of light, his antlers now appearing as buds of golden radiance that would grow throughout the returning season of illumination. The winter solstice celebration involved rituals of sympathetic magic designed to encourage the sun's return and to honor Cernunnos in his sacrificial aspect. Evergreen trees were brought into homes and decorated with symbols of light and life, their continuing greenness serving as promises that the death of winter was only temporary. Gifts were exchanged to demonstrate the principle of reciprocity that governed all relationships between humans and the divine world. Special foods were prepared and shared, with portions always reserved for the spirits and for Cernunnos himself, acknowledging his role in providing the abundance that sustained human communities through the lean months of winter. As the light grew stronger and the first signs of spring began to appear, Cernunnos manifested in his aspect as the young lord, the adolescent god whose growing power drove the sap upward in the trees and called the first flowers from their winter sleep. His antlers at this season were slender and graceful, covered with the soft velvet of new growth, symbolizing the tender but irresistible force of emerging life. Celtic communities celebrated the festival of Imbolc at this time, honoring the stirring of life beneath the still frozen earth and preparing for the more dramatic transformations that would come with the spring equinox. Imbolc was particularly associated with the lactation of sheep and cattle, the first sign that the breeding season had been successful and that new life was preparing to enter the world. Cernunnos in his aspect as young lord was honored as the patron of all young animals, the divine force that protected newborns through their most vulnerable period and ensured their successful integration into the herds and flocks. Rituals at Imbolc often involved the blessing of pregnant animals and the preparation of special foods from the first milk of the season, offerings that recognized Cernunnos' role in the fertility cycles that sustained both human and animal communities. The spring equinox brought the festival of Ostara, the celebration of perfect balance between light and dark that preceded the triumph of the growing season. At this pivotal moment in the year's cycle, Cernunnos appeared in his most dynamic aspect as the Lord of the Hunt, the mature god whose power was reaching its peak and whose domain extended over all the wild creatures that were beginning their spring migrations and mating rituals. His antlers now appeared in their full glory, branching crowns of bone and light that caught and reflected the strengthening sun, symbols of the masculine principle in perfect harmony with the awakening feminine energies of the earth. Ostara celebrations involved rituals of renewal and purification, as communities prepared for the intensive activity of the growing season. Sacred springs were visited and offerings made to ensure their continued flow and purity. Seeds were blessed and planted in ceremonial gardens dedicated to the gods. Young people who had undergone their winter initiation trials were formally welcomed into adult society, receiving new names and responsibilities that reflected their transformed status within the community. Cernunnos was honored as the divine patron of these initiates, the god who had guided them through the ordeals of spiritual death and rebirth that prepared them for full participation in the adult world. The festival of Beltane marked the true beginning of summer and the peak of Cernunnos' power as the lord of fertility. At this most joyous of celebrations, his aspect emphasized his role as the divine lover, the masculine force that united with the feminine principle of the earth to create the abundance of the growing season. His antlers appeared wreathed with flowers and green leaves, living crowns that symbolized the perfect marriage between animal vitality and plant wisdom. Beltane was a time of sacred sexuality, when the life force that flowed through all existence was celebrated and honored through rituals that connected human passion with cosmic creativity. The Beltane celebrations were perhaps the most elaborate and joyous of all Celtic festivals, involving entire communities in rituals that lasted for days and included elaborate ceremonies, competitive games, artistic performances, and sacred marriages between carefully selected couples who represented the union of divine masculine and feminine energies. Great fires were lit on hilltops, and cattle were driven between them for purification and blessing before being taken to their summer pastures. Maypoles were erected and decorated with ribbons and flowers, their vertical forms representing the masculine principle while the circular dances performed around them honored the feminine principle of cyclical time. As the wheel turned toward the summer solstice, Cernunnos reached the peak of his solar aspect as the Lord of Light. At the moment of Letha, When the sun reached its highest point in the sky and the hours of daylight stretched to their maximum length, his antlers appeared as pure light, branching rays of golden fire that illuminated all the hidden corners of the forest and revealed the sacred geometry that connected all living things. This was the moment of greatest power and also the beginning of the decline toward autumn, for Celtic wisdom understood that every peak contained the seeds of its own transformation. The summer solstice celebrations honored Cernunnos as the fully realized god, the divine consciousness that had achieved perfect balance between all opposing forces. Rituals at this time often involved tests of skill and strength that allowed community members to demonstrate their own development and to receive recognition for their achievements. Healers gathered medicinal plants at their peak potency, understanding that the concentrated solar energy of the solstice enhanced the effectiveness of all natural remedies. Sacred marriages were blessed by Cernunnos in his aspect as the divine witness, the consciousness that validated human commitments by connecting them to cosmic law. As the year progressed toward Lugnasad, the festival of the first harvest, Cernunnos began his transformation into the aspect of the sacrificial king, the god who willingly gave his life to ensure the continuation of abundance. His antlers at this season showed the first signs of the wear that would lead to their eventual shedding, symbolic of the voluntary sacrifice that made renewal possible. The grain harvest was understood as a sacred drama in which Cernunnos played the central role, dying in the cutting of the wheat and barley so that human communities could survive the coming winter. Lugnasad celebrations combined thanksgiving for the harvest with rituals that honored the sacrificial aspect of the divine masculine principle. The first loaves baked from the new grain were offered to Cernunnos before any human consumption occurred. Competitive games and contests honored the peak of summer's vitality while acknowledging that this peak necessarily preceded the decline toward autumn. Handfasting ceremonies and trial marriages recognized the continuing importance of fertility and partnership while preparing for the more introspective season that lay ahead. Finally, as the wheel completed its revolution with the autumn equinox, Cernunnos appeared in his aspect as the wise elder, the god who had experienced the full cycle of growth, maturity, and decline and was prepared to share the wisdom gained through this eternal journey. His antlers at this season appeared ancient and weathered, heavy with the accumulated experience of countless cycles, ready to be shed so that the cycle could begin anew. The autumn equinox marked the second moment of perfect balance in the year, the time when day and night stood in equilibrium before the dark half of the year claimed its dominance. The autumn celebrations honored Cernunnos as the teacher and guide, the divine consciousness that helped souls prepare for the journey into the darker months of inner reflection and spiritual development. The second harvest brought in the fruits and nuts that would provide sustenance through the winter, while rituals of preservation and storage acknowledged the importance of planning and foresight in surviving the challenges ahead. Elder members of the community were particularly honored at this time, their wisdom and experience recognized as valuable resources that would help guide the tribe through whatever difficulties the dark season might bring. And so the great wheel turned, carrying Cernunnos through his eternal cycle of death and rebirth, teaching all who had eyes to see that consciousness itself was the unchanging constant that made all change possible. In the depths of the primeval forest, where ancient trees cast shadows that had not moved in centuries and the paths known only to deer and wolf wound through groves untouched by human feet, there existed a mystery that struck at the very heart of Celtic understanding about life and death. This was the sacred hunt, the eternal dance between hunter and prey that revealed the fundamental truth about existence, that all life depends upon the willing sacrifice of other life, and that death and birth are not opposites but partners in the cosmic dance of becoming. Cernunnos embodied this mystery in ways that challenged simple human categories of understanding. He was simultaneously the great hunter, master of all the arts of tracking and stalking, and the willing prey, the sacrificial god who offered himself to sustain the lives of others. His antlers marked him as the king of the deer, the magnificent stag who ruled the forest through his majesty and wisdom, yet those same antlers were shed each year in a symbolic death that presaged their renewal. In understanding this dual nature, the ancient Celts gained access to profound truths about the nature of existence itself. The sacred hunt was never about violence or domination in the crude sense that modern minds might imagine. It was instead a complex spiritual transaction, a negotiation between different forms of consciousness that honored the needs and dignity of all participants. The true hunter, guided by Cernunnos' teachings, understood that taking the life of another being was a sacred act that created obligations and responsibilities that extended far beyond the moment of the kill. Every successful hunt required not only skill and patience, but also proper ritual preparation, correct spiritual attitude, and appropriate ceremonies of gratitude and reciprocity. The preparation for a sacred hunt began long before the hunter entered the forest. Days or even weeks might be spent in purification rituals, fasting, and meditation designed to align the hunter's consciousness with the deeper purposes of the hunt. The hunter would seek visions and dreams that revealed which animals were willing to sacrifice themselves and which should be left to live and breed. Divination rituals using ogham sticks, animal bones, or other traditional methods helped determine the most auspicious times and directions for the hunt. Most importantly, the hunter would commune with Cernunnos himself, seeking the god's blessing and guidance for the sacred task ahead. This communion with Cernunnos often took the form of solitary vigils in sacred groves or at forest shrines dedicated to the horned god. The hunter would sit in meditation through the dark hours before dawn, opening his consciousness to receive visions and guidance from the divine hunter. Sometimes Cernunnos would appear in dreams, taking the form of a great stag with eyes that held human intelligence, leading the hunter along forest paths to clearings where deer grazed peacefully, indicating which animals had agreed to give their lives. At other times, the guidance came through more subtle signs: the direction of the wind, the flight patterns of birds, the behavior of other animals encountered along the way. When the actual hunt began, it unfolded according to principles that modern hunters might find strange and impractical. The sacred hunt was not primarily about efficiency or success in terms of simply killing animals and bringing home meat. It was instead a ritual drama that honored the sacred relationship between all living beings and acknowledged the cosmic necessity that some must die so that others might live. The hunter moved through the forest with heightened awareness, his senses attuned not only to the practical signs that would lead him to game, but also to the spiritual currents that flowed through the natural world. The approach to potential prey was conducted with reverence and ceremony. The true hunter would spend long minutes in silent communion with the animal he intended to take, explaining his need and asking for the creature's consent to the sacrifice. Celtic tradition held that animals approached in this way would sometimes simply stand still and wait for the hunter's arrow, accepting their role in the sacred transaction. Other times, the animal would bound away, indicating that it was not the right moment for its sacrifice, and the wise hunter would not pursue it further but would wait for another opportunity with a different animal. The moment of the kill was surrounded by ritual and ceremony designed to honor the spirit of the slain animal and to ensure its safe passage to the otherworld. As the arrow found its mark or the spear struck home, the hunter would speak words of gratitude and blessing, acknowledging the gift that was being given and promising that the sacrifice would not be wasted. The death of the animal was seen not as the ending of its existence, but as a transformation, a change of form that allowed its essence to continue in new ways. Part of its spirit would nourish the hunter and his community through its flesh, while another part would return to Cernunnos to be reborn in new animal form. The ceremonies surrounding the death of the hunted animal were elaborate and specific. The hunter would kneel beside the fallen creature and place his hands upon its body, feeling for the moment when its spirit departed and offering prayers to guide it safely on its journey. The first blood was always offered to Cernunnos, poured upon the earth or painted upon nearby trees as a sign of respect and gratitude. The heart was often removed and buried at the base of a sacred tree, ensuring that the animal's courage and strength would be absorbed by the forest and eventually return to nourish new life. But the sacred hunt had another dimension that was even more mysterious and profound. Cernunnos himself participated in the eternal hunt not only as the divine guide who oversaw the activities of mortal hunters, but as both the ultimate hunter and the ultimate prey. In his aspect as the great hunter, he pursued the most elusive game of all: wisdom, truth, and understanding of the deepest mysteries of existence. His quarry was not any physical animal, but the spiritual essence that animated all life, the divine spark that could only be captured through complete surrender of the ego and total identification with the cosmic process. In this ultimate hunt, Cernunnos employed weapons that were not made of wood and metal, but of consciousness itself. His bow was formed from pure intention, its string woven from the threads of fate that connected all beings in the web of existence. His arrows were thought so perfectly aimed and concentrated that they could pierce through the veils of illusion that normally hide spiritual truth from ordinary perception. His tracking skills allowed him to follow the subtle traces left by divine consciousness as it moved through the world, manifesting as beauty, as love, as the mysterious intelligence that guided the growth of plants and the migrations of animals. But in an even more profound mystery, Cernunnos was also the prey in this ultimate hunt, the divine quarry that allowed itself to be pursued and captured by those seekers who had developed the skill and dedication necessary for such ultimate game. In this aspect, he appeared as the White Hart, the legendary deer whose capture granted the hunter access to the deepest mysteries of the otherworld. The White Hart was said to appear only to the most worthy seekers, those who had purified their hearts and developed their spiritual abilities to the point where they could perceive and pursue such transcendent game. The hunt for the White Hart was understood to be a lifelong quest that few would ever complete successfully. It required not only the ordinary skills of the hunter, patience, stealth, marksmanship, and tracking ability, but also profound spiritual development, unwavering dedication to truth, and the willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of ultimate understanding. Many seekers spent decades following the trail of the White Hart, catching only occasional glimpses of their divine quarry, experiencing moments of profound insight and revelation that sustained them through long periods of searching and frustration. Those rare individuals who successfully completed the hunt for the White Hart underwent a transformation so complete that they could hardly be considered the same people who had begun the quest. They had, in a sense, become one with their quarry, their consciousness so perfectly aligned with the divine consciousness embodied by Cernunnos that the distinction between hunter and hunted ceased to have meaning. These transformed individuals often became shamans, druids, or other types of spiritual teachers, their role being to guide others who were beginning their own hunts for the White Hart. The Celtic understanding of the hunt also extended to the realm of warfare, where similar principles of sacred reciprocity and spiritual transformation applied. The warrior who went into battle under Cernunnos' protection understood that he was participating in the same cosmic drama that played out in the forest between hunter and prey. He might be the hunter, blessed with strength and skill to overcome his enemies, or he might be the hunted, called upon to offer his life in service to his tribe and his gods. Either role was equally sacred, equally necessary for the maintenance of cosmic balance. Celtic warriors often wore symbols of Cernunnos into battle, images of stags, representations of antlers, or torques that connected them to the god's power and protection. They understood that true victory in battle came not from superior weapons or tactics alone, but from proper spiritual alignment with the forces that governed life and death. A warrior who fought with Cernunnos' blessing fought not from hatred or anger, but from love of his people and dedication to the cosmic order that required the strong to protect the weak and the brave to face danger on behalf of the community. The weapons of such spiritually aligned warriors were consecrated tools, blessed in ceremonies that connected them to Cernunnos' divine power. Swords were forged with ritual prayers and offerings, their metal containing fragments of meteoric iron that had fallen from the heavens or that had been gathered from sacred sites. Spears were tipped with points carved from the antlers of stags that had died naturally, their bone retaining the power of Cernunnos' crown. Shields bore images of the horned god or symbols associated with his protection, serving as both physical defense and spiritual talismans. The aftermath of battle, like the aftermath of the hunt, required elaborate ceremonies to honor the spirits of the slain and to maintain the spiritual balance that made such violence a sacred rather than a purely destructive act. Celtic warriors would gather the weapons and ornaments of worthy enemies, offering them to Cernunnos as gifts that honored the courage and skill of the defeated. The heads of particularly brave foes were sometimes preserved and honored, not as trophies of domination, but as recognition of the sacred nature of the warrior's sacrifice. These practices, shocking to modern sensibilities, reflected the Celtic understanding that death in battle was a form of spiritual transformation that required acknowledgement and ceremony. Through all these manifestations, the forest hunt, the quest for the White Hart, the warrior's battle, Cernunnos taught the fundamental lesson that life and death are not separate phenomena but aspects of a single, unified process. The hunter who truly understood his god knew that every kill was also a kind of suicide, every victory a form of defeat, every ending a new beginning. This paradoxical wisdom lay at the heart of Celtic spirituality and explained why Cernunnos, the god of life and death, of hunt and sacrifice, of victory and defeat, held such a central place in their understanding of existence itself. Beneath the roots of the world tree, deeper than the deepest wells, farther down than the most ambitious miners had ever dared to dig, lay the realm that the Celts called the Otherworld, though it was also the underworld, the land of the ancestors, the domain of the spirits who had completed their earthly journeys. This was not a place of punishment or torment as later traditions would imagine, but a realm of profound beauty and wisdom, where souls went to rest, to learn, and to prepare for their next adventures in the endless cycle of existence. And serving as guide and guardian of this mysterious realm was Cernunnos in his aspect as Lord of the Dead, the divine psychopomp who ensured safe passage between the worlds. The journey to the underworld could be undertaken in several ways, each path requiring different preparations and offering different experiences to the traveler. The most common route was the natural one followed by all souls at the moment of death, when the silver cord that connected spirit to body was finally severed and consciousness found itself free to explore realms that had been hidden during earthly life. But the living could also journey to the underworld through deep meditation, through shamanic practices that allowed consciousness to separate temporarily from the physical form, or through the ritual consumption of sacred plants that opened the doors of perception to normally invisible dimensions of reality. The entrance to the underworld was not a single location but a threshold that existed wherever the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Sacred caves, particularly those that descended deep into the earth and contained underground streams or lakes, were recognized as natural gateways to the realm below. Ancient burial mounds, built over thousands of years by countless generations of Celtic peoples, served as artificial doorways where the accumulated spiritual energy of the dead created permanent openings between dimensions. Certain springs and wells, especially those whose waters emerged from unknown depths and never froze even in the harshest winter, were understood to be direct connections to the rivers that flowed through the underworld. But perhaps most mysterious of all were the temporal gateways that opened at certain times of year when the cosmic conditions were right for travel between worlds. The festival of Samhain marked the most significant of these openings, when the veil between living and dead became so thin that spirits could cross over in either direction almost at will. During the 12 nights between the winter solstice and the new year, experienced shamans and druids could journey to the underworld with relative safety, returning with prophecies and wisdom for the coming year. The dark of the moon each month offered brief opportunities for such journeys, though these required more skill and preparation than the seasonal openings. Those who undertook the journey to the underworld while still living required extensive preparation and the protection of powerful allies in the spirit world. Cernunnos served as the primary guide for such expeditions, but approaching him required proper protocols and offerings. The would-be traveler first spent days or weeks in purification rituals, fasting, meditation, and prayer designed to raise their spiritual vibration and make them suitable companions for divine consciousness. Special clothing was prepared, often including items made from the hide, fur, or feathers of animals that had been ritually sacrificed for this purpose, creating a sympathetic connection to Cernunnos' domain over the animal kingdom. The actual invocation of Cernunnos as guide required ceremonies of great solemnity and power. These rituals were typically conducted in sacred groves, at stone circles, or in caves that were already recognized as gateways to the otherworld. The traveler would create a ritual space using ancient symbols and sacred objects, including antlers, torques, images of serpents, and representations of the world tree. Offerings were made of mead, wine, bread, and honey, foods that were believed to be particularly pleasing to the horned god. Most importantly, the traveler had to demonstrate genuine need for the journey, a purpose that served not just personal curiosity but the welfare of the community or the advancement of spiritual understanding. When Cernunnos accepted the invitation to serve as guide, his presence became unmistakable to the prepared consciousness. The air would grow thick with power, and shadows would begin to move independently of their sources. The sound of breathing that was not the traveler's own would become audible, along with the subtle creaking and rustling that suggested the presence of a large animal moving carefully through dense forest. Then, at the edge of vision, the great antlers would become visible, followed by eyes that held the wisdom of ages and a presence that was both comforting and overwhelming in its ancient authority. The descent to the underworld under Cernunnos' guidance was unlike any earthly journey. Physical laws seemed to become optional, with distances stretching or contracting according to spiritual rather than geometric principles. The traveler might find themselves walking down a spiral staircase carved into the living rock of a cave, each step taking them deeper into the earth and further from the familiar world of ordinary consciousness. Or they might discover that they were somehow moving through the trunk of an enormous tree, following passages that led downward through wood that glowed with its own inner light. Some travelers reported descending along the roots of the world tree itself, following pathways that connected the middle world to the deepest foundations of reality. The landscape of the underworld was unlike anything that existed in the upper realms. Here was a vast subterranean. The geography of the underworld followed dream logic rather than earthly physics. Vast forests of silver trees stretched to horizons that curved upward rather than away, their leaves chiming like bells in breezes that carried whispers of ancient languages. Rivers flowed uphill when they chose to, their waters sometimes liquid light, sometimes liquid memory, sometimes currents of pure emotion that could be felt rather than seen. Mountains rose from the earth like sleeping giants, their peaks disappearing into mists that might have been clouds or might have been the thoughts of dreaming gods. Throughout this strange landscape moved the inhabitants of the underworld, beings that had once been human but were now something more. The souls of the dead appeared not as the pale shades imagined by later mythologies, but as luminous beings whose forms reflected their true spiritual nature rather than the physical bodies they had worn during earthly life. Warriors who had died bravely in battle might appear as figures of living flame, their courage having been refined into pure solar energy. Wise druids and teachers manifested as beings of crystalline light, their accumulated knowledge having transformed them into living libraries of wisdom. Mothers who had died giving birth often appeared as fountains of nurturing energy, their love having become a force that sustained other souls in their spiritual development. But the underworld was not merely a resting place for human souls. It was also the home of the animal spirits, the collective consciousness of every species that had ever lived upon the earth. Here roamed the spectral forms of the great aurochs, those mighty wild cattle whose earthly descendants had been tamed into domestic herds. Here flew the spirits of birds whose species had vanished from the upper world, their songs creating harmonies that no living ear had heard for centuries. Most magnificent of all were the spirit deer, led by the great stags whose antlers branched into patterns of pure light, their presence serving as a constant reminder of Cernunnos' dominion over this realm. The purpose of the living person's journey to the underworld varied according to their spiritual development and the needs that had motivated their descent. Some came seeking wisdom from the ancestral spirits, guidance for decisions that would affect their communities, or insight into mysteries that could not be understood through ordinary means. Others sought healing for spiritual wounds that earthly medicine could not touch, traumas that had damaged their souls and required the intervention of powers greater than human knowledge. A few came in search of lost souls, loved ones who had died but had somehow become trapped between worlds, unable to complete their journey to the proper realm of rest and renewal. Cernunnos served different functions for different types of visitors to his underground domain. For those seeking wisdom, he appeared as the great teacher, sharing knowledge that could only be gained through direct experience of death and rebirth. He would lead such seekers to the great library caves where the accumulated learning of all human civilizations was stored in crystalline formations that could be read by consciousness rather than eyes. Or he might guide them to the amphitheaters where the greatest philosophers and mystics of all ages continued their discussions, debating questions that spanned multiple lifetimes and drawing conclusions that could revolutionize human understanding. For those who came seeking healing, Cernunnos manifested as the divine physician, whose understanding of the soul's anatomy far exceeded any earthly healer's knowledge of the body. He could see the spiritual wounds that festered beneath surface consciousness, the karmic tangles that bound souls to patterns of suffering, the energetic blockages that prevented the natural flow of life force through the spiritual body. His healing methods involved not medicines or surgeries, but direct manipulation of the fundamental energies that sustained existence, adjustments to the soul's vibration that allowed natural healing processes to resume their proper function. The most dangerous journeys to the underworld were those undertaken to rescue lost souls, for such missions required the living person to risk becoming trapped themselves in the liminal spaces between worlds. Cernunnos served as both guide and protector for these rescue missions, but he could not guarantee their success or even the safety of those who attempted them. The lost souls had usually become entangled in their own fears, regrets, or unfulfilled desires, creating prison-like structures of crystallized emotion that held them captive more effectively than any physical bonds. To free such souls required the rescuer to enter into their psychological prison and help them find the key to their own liberation. The trials faced by living visitors to the underworld were designed to test their spiritual development and prepare them for the greater mysteries they sought to understand. Some found themselves confronting their own shadows, the repressed or denied aspects of their personalities that had been hidden from conscious awareness. These shadow encounters could be terrifying, for they revealed the potential for evil that existed within even the most righteous souls, but they were also opportunities for integration and wholeness that could not be achieved through any other means. Others faced trials of courage, finding themselves in situations that required them to act heroically despite overwhelming fear. They might be called upon to defend innocent souls from predatory entities that fed on spiritual energy, or to carry messages through territories controlled by hostile forces. These trials tested not physical bravery but spiritual courage, the willingness to act according to higher principles even when such action might result in the destruction of the ego self. Those who passed these tests often returned to the upper world with enhanced psychic abilities and a fearlessness that served them well in future spiritual endeavors. The questions posed by the Council of Ancestors were not intellectual puzzles that could be solved through clever reasoning. They were spiritual koans that required the visitor to demonstrate their level of consciousness through the quality of their responses. What dies when nothing can be killed, they might ask, or where is the center of a circle that has no circumference? The correct answers came not from the mind but from direct spiritual perception, from the intuitive understanding that developed only through years of sincere spiritual practice. But the ultimate revelation reserved for the most advanced seekers was the direct encounter with the source of all existence, the primordial consciousness from which all individual souls had originally emerged and to which they would ultimately return. This encounter could not be described in words, for it transcended all categories of ordinary experience. Those who achieved it returned to the upper world transformed beyond recognition, their consciousness so expanded that they could perceive the divine presence in every aspect of earthly existence. They became living bridges between the worlds, their very presence serving to thin the veil between ordinary and transcendent reality. The return journey from the underworld was often more challenging than the descent, for the soul that had been expanded by exposure to transcendent realities had to somehow compress itself back into the limitations of physical existence. Cernunnos guided this process with infinite patience and skill, helping the traveler to integrate their experiences gradually so that their earthly consciousness could assimilate the new understanding without being overwhelmed or fragmented. Some required weeks or even months of careful guidance before they could function normally in ordinary reality, while others needed years of additional spiritual practice to fully understand what they had experienced. Those who completed the journey successfully carried within themselves a piece of the underworld's wisdom for the rest of their earthly lives. They became natural healers and teachers, their enhanced understanding allowing them to help others navigate the spiritual challenges of human existence. They often developed prophetic abilities, their consciousness having been attuned to the deeper patterns that governed the unfolding of events in the material world. Most importantly, they lost all fear of death, understanding it not as an ending but as a transition to expanded states of consciousness and continued opportunities for growth and service. In the sacred groves where moonlight filtered through ancient oaks to illuminate clearings carpeted with moss and wildflowers, where the very air pulsed with the creative energy that drove all life toward greater complexity and beauty, Cernunnos revealed himself in his most generative aspect as the divine source of fertility and abundance. This was not merely the crude fertility of animal mating, though that was certainly part of his domain, but the fundamental creative principle that manifested as the irrepressible urge of existence to multiply, diversify, and explore every possible form of expression. The ancient Celts understood fertility as a cosmic force that operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. At the most basic level, it was the biological drive that ensured the continuation of species through reproduction, the instinctual imperative that brought male and female together in the sacred act of generation. But at deeper levels, fertility was the creative intelligence that guided the evolution of consciousness itself, the force that drove simple organisms to become complex, that pushed individual awareness toward collective understanding, that impelled souls to seek ever more perfect expressions of their divine nature. Cernunnos embodied this multifaceted creative principle in forms that revealed its operation across all kingdoms of existence. In his aspect as the great stag, he represented the masculine pole of creativity, not the dominating masculine that seeks to possess and control, but the generative masculine that offers its essence freely in service to life's continuation. The seasonal shedding and regrowth of his antlers demonstrated the masculine principle's willingness to die to itself repeatedly so that renewal could occur. Each spring, as new antlers began to grow, they were soft and covered with velvet, vulnerable and tender like newborn creatures, requiring protection and nourishment before they hardened into weapons and symbols of mature power. The sacred marriage between masculine and feminine creative principles was celebrated throughout the Celtic year in festivals that honored different aspects of their union. At Beltane, the great fertility festival that marked the peak of spring's generative power, communities enacted ritual dramas that represented the cosmic wedding between the horned god and the earth goddess. These were not merely symbolic performances but genuine magical workings designed to align human consciousness with the creative forces that were reaching their annual climax in the natural world. The abundance that flowed from Cernunnos' fertility was not merely material prosperity but a richness that encompassed all aspects of life. Communities that properly honored him experienced not only successful harvests and thriving herds, but also cultural flowering that expressed itself in magnificent art, profound wisdom traditions, and social harmony that allowed every individual to contribute their unique gifts to the collective welfare. This holistic abundance required careful maintenance through ongoing relationship with the divine forces that sustained it. The rituals that maintained fertility and abundance were woven throughout the Celtic calendar, marking not only the major festivals but also the smaller celebrations that honored the daily miracles of growth and renewal. Each full moon brought ceremonies that celebrated the feminine principle of receptivity and nurturing, while each new moon honored the masculine principle of initiation and active creativity. The first appearance of spring flowers, the arrival of migrating birds, the leafing of trees, and the ripening of fruits all provided opportunities for communities to align themselves consciously with the creative forces flowing through the natural world. Agricultural work itself was understood as a form of worship, a collaboration between human consciousness and divine creativity. The preparation of fields for planting involved not only practical tasks like clearing, plowing, and fertilizing, but also ritual activities designed to invite Cernunnos' blessing on the enterprise. Seeds were blessed before planting, often mixed with offerings of mead or honey to make them attractive to the spirits of growth. Furrows were plowed according to sacred patterns that reflected cosmic principles, with the first and last rows dedicated specifically to the gods and left partially unharvested as offerings. The relationship between human fertility and the fertility of the land was understood to be direct and immediate. Couples who were trying to conceive would make love in newly planted fields, believing that their passion would be transferred to the seeds sleeping in the earth. Pregnant women would walk through growing crops, their swelling bellies serving as symbols and encouragements to the developing plants. Children born during harvest time were considered especially blessed, their life force having been enhanced by the concentrated creative energy present during the season of fruition. But Cernunnos also taught important lessons about the shadow side of fertility, the dangers that could arise when creative energy was misdirected or allowed to operate without wisdom and restraint. Unchecked fertility could lead to overpopulation, the exhaustion of resources, and ecological collapse. Creative energy that was not balanced by discrimination and purpose could manifest as chaos rather than order, destruction rather than construction. The wise worship of Cernunnos therefore included acknowledgement of the need for limits, for seasons of rest and restoration, for the periodic culling that maintained ecological balance. The autumn festivals celebrated this wisdom of restraint as much as they honored the abundance of the harvest. At Lugnasad, the first harvest festival, communities gathered not only to celebrate the success of their crops but also to make the difficult decisions about which seeds should be saved for next year's planting and which animals should be culled before winter. These decisions required the kind of long-term thinking that considered not just immediate needs but the welfare of future generations. Cernunnos was invoked as the wise counselor who could guide such choices, his eternal perspective providing insight into consequences that mortal minds might not foresee. The mysteries of fertility culminated in the understanding that true abundance came not from taking as much as possible from the natural world, but from giving as much as possible back to it. Communities that thrived over many generations were those that had learned to live in reciprocal relationship with the land and its creatures, taking only what they needed and offering their own creativity and labor in service to the greater web of life. This reciprocal relationship was the heart of Cernunnos' teaching about fertility, that true creative power came from recognizing oneself as part of a vast, interconnected system of mutual support and exchange. The human role in this cosmic fertility was that of conscious participants rather than mere beneficiaries. Through their awareness, intention, and ceremonial activities, humans could serve as conduits through which divine creative energy could manifest more perfectly in the material world. Through their art, their craft, their agriculture, and their child-rearing, they could contribute actively to the ongoing creation of beauty, order, and meaning in the cosmos. This participation in divine creativity was both humanity's greatest privilege and its most sacred responsibility. In the pre-dawn hours when the night sky began its gradual transformation from star-studded black to the deep indigo that heralded approaching dawn, when the forest held its breath in anticipation of the day's first stirring of life, Cernunnos appeared in his most mysterious aspect as the keeper of ancient wisdom. Seated in lotus position beneath the world tree, his antlered crown reaching toward the fading stars, he embodied the accumulated knowledge of ages, the deep understanding that could only be gained through countless cycles of experience, death, and rebirth. This was not wisdom as humans commonly understood it, not merely the accumulation of facts or the clever manipulation of ideas, but something far more profound and transformative. Cernunnos possessed the kind of knowing that comes from direct participation in the fundamental processes of existence, from having witnessed the birth and death of stars, the rise and fall of continents, the evolution of consciousness from its simplest to its most complex forms. His wisdom was living knowledge, dynamic and creative, capable of adapting to new circumstances while remaining grounded in eternal principles. The Druids, those learned priests who served as the intellectual and spiritual leaders of Celtic society, understood that their own considerable learning was merely a pale reflection of the infinite wisdom that Cernunnos embodied. They spent decades memorizing vast bodies of oral tradition that included not only religious teachings but also laws, histories, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and the practical skills needed to maintain Celtic civilization. Yet they knew that all their memorized knowledge was worthless unless it could be connected to the deeper understanding that flowed from direct communion with the divine source of all wisdom. The Druids' relationship with Cernunnos as wisdom keeper was one of humble apprenticeship, despite their exalted status within their communities. They approached him not as equals but as students seeking to touch the hem of infinite understanding, knowing that even their most advanced insights were elementary compared to his comprehensive awareness. The rituals they performed to invoke his teaching presence required the complete surrender of intellectual pride, the acknowledgement that human reason, however refined, was insufficient to grasp the deepest mysteries of existence. These rituals of wisdom-seeking often took place in sacred groves during the dark of the moon, when the absence of lunar light created optimal conditions for inner illumination. The Druid would fast for 3 days and nights, purifying both body and mind in preparation for contact with divine consciousness. Sacred fires were kindled using ancient techniques that required no metal tools, the flames serving as focal points for meditation and as offerings to attract Cernunnos' attention. Specific combinations of herbs were burned as incense, their smoke carrying prayers and petitions upward while creating altered states of consciousness that made communication with the divine realm possible. When Cernunnos responded to these invocations, his presence manifested first as a profound deepening of the silence that surrounded the sacred grove. This was not merely the absence of sound but a positive quality of stillness that seemed to contain infinite potential, like the moment before creation when all possibilities existed simultaneously without yet having taken form. Within this pregnant silence, the Druid would begin to receive teachings that came not as words or images but as direct downloads of understanding that bypassed ordinary cognitive processes. The wisdom that Cernunnos transmitted dealt with questions that had puzzled human consciousness since its first awakening to self-awareness. What was the purpose of suffering, and why did the gods allow pain and loss to afflict even the most virtuous souls? How could individual will be reconciled with cosmic law, and what was the proper balance between personal desire and universal harmony? What happened to consciousness after death, and how did the lessons learned in one lifetime carry forward to influence future incarnations? These and countless other mysteries were illuminated through direct transmission of divine understanding. But Cernunnos' wisdom encompassed far more than abstract philosophical concepts. He was also the repository of practical knowledge that humans needed to live successfully in the natural world, which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, how to read weather patterns in the behavior of animals, what times of year were most favorable for different types of activities. This practical wisdom was inseparable from its spiritual dimensions, for Cernunnos understood that successful living required harmony between material needs and spiritual principles. The herbal knowledge that Druids received from Cernunnos was particularly profound, encompassing not only the physical properties of plants but their spiritual essences and energetic qualities. Each plant was understood to embody specific aspects of cosmic consciousness, making it useful not only for healing physical ailments but for addressing spiritual imbalances and psychological disturbances. The mighty oak, for example, contained the essence of strength and endurance, making it valuable for treating conditions involving weakness or lack of vitality. But it also embodied the principle of steadfast devotion, making it useful in rituals designed to strengthen commitment and resolve. Mistletoe, the mysterious plant that grew neither from earth nor water but suspended between heaven and earth on the branches of sacred trees, held special significance in Cernunnos' herbal wisdom. This golden-berried parasite represented the liminal consciousness that could exist between different states of being, making it invaluable for shamanic work that required travel between worlds. Druids harvested mistletoe with golden sickles during specific phases of the moon, following elaborate ceremonies that honored both the plant spirit and the tree that hosted it. The gathered mistletoe was used in the most sacred rituals, its essence helping participants to achieve the expanded states of consciousness necessary for communion with divine forces. The astronomical knowledge that Cernunnos possessed and occasionally shared with his Druidic students was vast beyond human comprehension. He understood the great cycles that governed not only the movements of planets and stars but the evolution of consciousness itself through cosmic ages. The precession of the equinoxes, the long slow wobble of Earth's axis that took nearly 26,000 years to complete one full cycle, was recognized by Druids as a cosmic clock that marked the passage of spiritual ages and the periodic opportunities for quantum leaps in collective awareness. The stone circles and other megalithic monuments that dotted the Celtic landscape were built according to astronomical principles that Druids learned from Cernunnos, their alignments encoding knowledge about celestial mechanics that would not be rediscovered by mainstream science for centuries. These monuments served as more than mere calendars or observatories, they were instruments for focusing and directing cosmic energies, tools for amplifying human consciousness and facilitating communication with divine realms. The precise placement of stones created resonance chambers that could induce altered states of consciousness, making it easier for participants in ceremonies to achieve the expanded awareness necessary for receiving wisdom transmissions from Cernunnos. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Cernunnos' role as wisdom keeper was his understanding of the evolutionary purpose behind all existence. He perceived the vast intelligence that guided the development of cosmos from simple to complex, from unconscious to conscious, from individual to collective awareness. This evolutionary wisdom revealed that every experience, no matter how painful or apparently meaningless, served the purpose of advancing consciousness toward greater understanding, compassion, and creative power. The Druids who successfully established deep connection with Cernunnos as wisdom keeper underwent profound transformations that affected not only their intellectual understanding but their entire mode of being. They developed what might be called cosmic consciousness, the ability to perceive reality from a divine perspective that transcended the limitations of individual personality and cultural conditioning. This expanded awareness allowed them to serve their communities with unprecedented effectiveness, their counsel informed by understanding that drew from the deepest sources of wisdom available to human consciousness. These transformed Druids became living bridges between human and divine consciousness, their very presence serving to elevate the spiritual atmosphere of their communities. They could perceive the karmic patterns that governed individual lives and community destinies, offering guidance that helped people align their personal will with cosmic purpose. They understood the deeper meanings behind apparently random events, the hidden connections that linked all phenomena in webs of cause and effect that spanned multiple lifetimes and cosmic cycles. The wisdom traditions that these enlightened druids established became the foundation for Celtic civilization at its highest expression. Their teachings about the interconnectedness of all life informed social structures that honored both individual creativity and collective harmony. Their understanding of natural law guided the development of legal systems that sought to restore balance rather than merely punish wrongdoing. Their knowledge of cosmic cycles influenced agricultural practices, warfare strategies, and ceremonial calendars that kept human activities aligned with the greater rhythms of existence. The key to receiving Cernunnos' wisdom was not intellectual brilliance or scholarly achievement, but sincere humility and genuine desire to serve the greater good rather than merely personal ambition. Those who approached him with pure hearts and clear intentions found that understanding flowed to them in whatever form they could best receive and utilize it. Simple people often received simple wisdom that was perfectly suited to their needs, while complex thinkers might receive teachings that challenged their most sophisticated concepts and pushed them toward even greater depths of understanding. As the Great Wheel of the Year completed another full revolution and the Celtic calendar prepared to begin anew with the festival of Samhain, the ancient peoples gathered in their sacred groves to witness one of the most profound mysteries in their spiritual tradition, the eternal return of Cernunnos from his journey through death into renewed life. This was not merely a mythological story told around winter fires, but a cosmic drama that played out on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, demonstrating the fundamental truth that consciousness itself was indestructible and that what appeared to be endings were always transformations in disguise. The concept of eternal return was central to Celtic understanding of existence, informing their attitudes toward death, their practices of reincarnation, and their confidence that the cycles of nature would continue regardless of temporary setbacks or apparent catastrophes. They understood that Cernunnos, like all divine consciousness, existed outside the linear time that governed mortal experience, yet chose to participate in temporal cycles as a way of demonstrating cosmic principles that could guide human consciousness toward greater wisdom and spiritual development. The mythological narrative of Cernunnos' eternal return was preserved in various forms throughout the Celtic world, each region and tribe adding their own cultural elements while maintaining the essential structure of the sacred story. According to these traditions, at the end of each year Cernunnos voluntarily entered into the realm of death, not because he was compelled by forces beyond his control, but as a conscious sacrifice offered for the renewal of all existence. His death was simultaneously the death of the old year, the death of outworn patterns of thought and behavior, and the death of limitations that had previously constrained the development of consciousness. During his sojourn in the underworld, Cernunnos underwent experiences that paralleled those of every soul that had ever died and been reborn. He confronted the shadow aspects of existence, the pain, suffering, and apparent meaninglessness that seemed to contradict the basic goodness of creation. He experienced the dissolution of all familiar forms and identities, the terrifying freedom that came when every known reference point disappeared and consciousness found itself floating in an ocean of pure potential. Most importantly, he discovered within the heart of apparent nothingness the indestructible seed of new creation, the eternal flame of awareness that could never be extinguished no matter how complete the darkness appeared to be. The transformations that Cernunnos underwent during his death journey were reflected in the natural world during the dark months of winter. Trees that had been fully leafed and flowering stood bare against gray skies, their apparent lifelessness masking the vital processes that continued in roots and trunk. Animals retreated into hibernation or migrated to distant lands, their absence creating an illusion of death that would be dramatically reversed with the return of spring. Even the sun seemed to die during the winter solstice, its light growing weaker and its presence more brief with each passing day, until the moment of greatest darkness when the eternal return began to manifest once again. But the Celtic understanding of Cernunnos' return was far more complex than simple seasonal symbolism. His emergence from the underworld brought with it accumulated wisdom and power that had been gained through direct experience of ultimate dissolution and regeneration. He returned not merely as the same consciousness that had died, but as an enhanced version of himself, enriched by integration of lessons that could only be learned through the complete surrender that death demanded. This pattern of death leading to enhanced life rather than mere restoration was the template that governed all evolutionary development, both individual and cosmic. The rituals that celebrated Cernunnos' eternal return were among the most elaborate and significant in the Celtic ceremonial calendar. They began during the 12 days between the winter solstice and the new year, a liminal period when the veil between worlds was thin and the influence of the returning god could be felt by those whose spiritual senses had been properly prepared. Communities would gather in their sacred groves, lighting fires that served both as beacons to guide the returning deity and as offerings that demonstrated their faith in his eventual resurrection. The central ritual of the eternal return involved the dramatic enactment of Cernunnos' death and rebirth, with community members taking various roles in the cosmic drama. A carefully chosen individual would represent the dying god, undergoing symbolic death through elaborate ceremonies that might include temporary burial, sensory deprivation, or induced trance states that simulated the dissolution of ordinary consciousness. Other participants would take the roles of the spirits and forces that Cernunnos encountered during his underworld journey, creating a ritual theater that made the abstract spiritual principles concrete and experientially available to the entire community. The moment of the god's return was marked by the dramatic resurrection of his human representative, often accompanied by the lighting of new fires, the sounding of horns and drums, and the joyous celebration of renewed life. The reborn figure would emerge wearing fresh clothing and new ornaments, often including antlers or other symbols that identified him with the returning Cernunnos. His first words and actions after resurrection were considered prophetic, carrying messages from the underworld that could guide the community through the challenges of the coming year. But the eternal return was not limited to seasonal celebrations or mythological narratives. It was understood by Celtic wisdom keepers to be a fundamental pattern that operated continuously at all levels of existence, from the microscopic cycles that governed cellular regeneration to the vast cosmic cycles that marked the birth and death of universes. Every breath was a miniature version of the eternal return, with exhalation representing death and inhalation representing rebirth. Every sleep cycle recapitulated the pattern, with dreams serving as journeys to otherworldly realms that brought back insights and energies that enriched waking consciousness. The Druids taught that human souls participated directly in Cernunnos' eternal return through the process of reincarnation, which was understood not as punishment for past mistakes but as voluntary participation in the cosmic process of evolution through experience. Each lifetime was seen as one complete cycle of the eternal return, with birth corresponding to emergence from the underworld, life representing the period of active engagement with material existence, and death marking the beginning of another journey through spiritual realms that would prepare the soul for its next incarnation. The lessons that souls learned during their underworld journeys between incarnations were considered to be the most valuable education available to consciousness, for they dealt with ultimate questions that could not be addressed through ordinary earthly experience. Souls learned about the true nature of identity, discovering which aspects of personality were merely temporary masks and which represented their eternal essence. They experienced directly the interconnectedness of all existence, understanding how their individual choices and actions affected the welfare of countless other beings throughout the web of life. Most importantly, they gained experiential knowledge of the indestructible nature of consciousness itself, the awareness that no matter what apparent disasters or catastrophes might occur, the essential core of being could never be destroyed or permanently damaged. This understanding of eternal return had profound implications for how Celtic peoples approached the challenges and opportunities of daily life. Knowing that consciousness was indestructible and that apparent endings always led to new beginnings gave them remarkable resilience in the face of difficulties that might have crushed spirits informed by more pessimistic worldviews. They could face death with equanimity, understanding it as a transformation rather than a termination. They could endure defeats and failures with patience, knowing that the wheel of fortune would inevitably turn and bring new opportunities for success and happiness. The eternal return also informed Celtic attitudes towards social and political challenges. When their communities were threatened by invaders or natural disasters, they drew strength from the understanding that such challenges were temporary phases in larger cycles that would ultimately lead to renewal and growth. This perspective did not make them passive or fatalistic, but rather gave them the long-term vision necessary for making decisions that served not only immediate needs but the welfare of future generations. They could plant trees that would not mature for decades, knowing that their descendants would benefit from their foresight. They could preserve traditions and knowledge through periods of apparent decline, confident that favorable conditions would eventually return and make such preservation valuable. The eternal return was also understood to operate at the level of ideas and cultural developments. Wisdom traditions that seemed to disappear during dark ages were believed to be merely dormant, waiting for the proper conditions to re-emerge in new forms adapted to changed circumstances. Spiritual insights that had been lost or forgotten would spontaneously arise again when human consciousness was ready to receive and integrate them. This understanding encouraged Celtic scholars and mystics to preserve knowledge even when its immediate practical value was not apparent, trusting that future generations would rediscover its relevance and importance. The pattern of eternal return that Cernunnos embodied also provided a template for understanding historical cycles and cultural evolution. Civilizations that rose to great heights and then declined were not seen as failures but as part of natural cycles that allowed different approaches to human organization to be explored and their lessons integrated into the growing wisdom of the species. The Celtic peoples themselves understood that their own cultural achievements were part of such a cycle, valuable contributions to human development that would influence future societies even if their specific forms did not survive unchanged. As the great wheel of the year turned once again and the festivals of Cernunnos' eternal return were celebrated with renewed devotion and understanding, the ancient wisdom keepers of the Celtic world looked both backward to the accumulated insights of their ancestors and forward to the unlimited possibilities that awaited human consciousness in its ongoing evolution. They understood that they were participants in a cosmic drama that had no final conclusion, only endless opportunities for growth, discovery, and creative expression. And at the center of this eternal dance of death and rebirth, serving as both guide and companion for every conscious being, stood Cernunnos in his infinite wisdom and compassion, forever demonstrating that love was stronger than death and that consciousness could never be conquered by the forces of dissolution. The eternal return was not just his mystery, but the mystery that lived within every heart that had ever beaten, every mind that had ever wondered, every soul that had ever dared to hope that existence itself was ultimately meaningful and good. In the concrete valleys of modern cities, where steel and glass towers reach toward polluted skies and the rhythms of traffic replace the ancient songs of wind through forest leaves, something stirs in the depths of human consciousness that refuses to be silenced by progress or domesticated by civilization. It is the echo of older wisdom, the persistent memory of what we once knew when our ancestors sat around fires in sacred groves and felt the presence of gods walking among the trees. And strongest among these echoes is the call of Cernunnos, the horned god whose antlered crown still catches the light of urban moons and whose wild heart still beats within the breasts of those who have not forgotten entirely what it means to be truly human. The modern revival of Celtic spirituality has brought Cernunnos back into active worship and relationship with contemporary seekers, though these new forms of devotion necessarily differ from their ancient predecessors. Modern Druids and practitioners of Celtic Reconstructionist religion study archaeological evidence and surviving folklore with scholarly rigor, attempting to recreate authentic forms of ancient practice adapted to contemporary circumstances. Wiccan and neo-pagan communities have embraced him as the horned god, the masculine divine principle that balances the feminine goddess in their understanding of cosmic polarity. Even individuals who follow no specific religious path often find themselves drawn to his imagery and symbolism, sensing in his antlered figure something essential about the wild nature that still lives within civilized humanity. But the modern echo of Cernunnos manifests in ways that extend far beyond explicit religious practice. The environmental movement, with its recognition that human welfare is inseparably connected to the health of natural ecosystems, reflects his ancient teaching about the sacred relationship between consciousness and the living world. Wilderness therapy programs that take troubled individuals into natural settings to rediscover their authentic selves echo the Celtic understanding that true healing could only occur through reconnection with wild nature. The growing interest in sustainable agriculture, permaculture, and organic farming methods reflects the wisdom he embodied about working with natural forces rather than attempting to dominate them. The psychological insights of modern depth psychology have provided new language for understanding aspects of Cernunnos that ancient peoples experienced directly but could not explain in scientific terms. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, the shared psychic foundation that contains the archetypal patterns common to all human consciousness, offers a framework for understanding how the horned god can appear spontaneously in the dreams and visions of people who have never encountered his mythology consciously. The archetype of the wild man, the untamed masculine principle that exists in tension with civilized society, provides psychological context for his role as a figure who challenges conventional boundaries and limitations. Jungian analysts have noted the frequency with which Cernunnos-like figures appear in the dreams and active imagination work of modern individuals who are struggling to reconnect with aspects of themselves that have been suppressed or forgotten in the process of socialization. The appearance of antlered beings in therapeutic work often signals the emergence of creative and instinctual energies that had been buried beneath layers of cultural conditioning and personal trauma. Working with such archetypal material can lead to profound healing and integration, as individuals learn to honor both their civilized achievements and their wild nature. The men's movement that emerged in the late 20th century drew heavily on archetypal imagery that included many aspects associated with Cernunnos. Men seeking to rediscover authentic masculine identity beyond the narrow roles prescribed by industrial society found inspiration in the image of the horned god as a figure who embodied strength without aggression, leadership without domination, and sexuality without exploitation. Men's gatherings often included rituals that honored the wild man archetype, using drumming, chanting, and time spent in natural settings to reconnect with instinctual wisdom that had been lost in the transition to modern urban life. The growing awareness of ecological crisis and climate change has given new urgency to the ancient wisdom that Cernunnos represents. His understanding of the sacred relationship between human consciousness and the natural world offers perspectives that are desperately needed as our species grapples with the consequences of treating nature as a collection of resources to be exploited rather than a living system of which we are integral parts. Environmental philosophers and activists often find themselves articulating positions that echo his teaching about reciprocity, sustainability, and the need to align human activities with natural cycles and limitations. The modern revival of interest in Celtic culture and spirituality has been fueled partly by the recognition that these ancient traditions offer alternatives to the materialistic and individualistic worldview that has dominated Western civilization for the past several centuries. Cernunnos represents values that many contemporary people sense are missing from modern life: connection to nature, acceptance of natural cycles of death and rebirth, integration of wild and civilized aspects of human nature, and recognition of the sacred dimension of ordinary existence. His mythology provides a symbolic language for articulating insights about consciousness and reality that are difficult to express in purely rational or scientific terms. The artistic and cultural manifestations of Cernunnos' modern echo are found throughout contemporary creative expression. Fantasy literature often features characters and imagery that draw directly or indirectly from his mythology: forest gods, shapeshifters, guardians of wild places, and figures who mediate between human and animal consciousness. Popular music, particularly in genres associated with folk revival and pagan themes, frequently invokes his name and imagery as symbols of connection to authentic and wild aspects of human nature. Visual artists working with themes of nature mysticism, masculine spirituality, and environmental consciousness often find themselves creating images that echo traditional depictions of the horned god. The therapeutic applications of Cernunnos-inspired practices are being explored by counselors and healers who recognize the need for approaches that address not only psychological symptoms but spiritual disconnection and ecological alienation. Wilderness therapy programs that take clients into natural settings for healing work often invoke principles that parallel his role as guide and healer in wild places. Art therapy and expressive arts therapy sometimes use imagery and exercises that help clients reconnect with their wild nature and creative instincts. Body-based therapies that emphasize instinctual wisdom and natural movement patterns reflect understanding of the integration between consciousness and physical embodiment that Cernunnos represents. The modern echo of Cernunnos also manifests in surprising ways within mainstream culture and institutions. Conservation organizations use imagery and language that reflect his values even when they make no explicit reference to his mythology. Educational programs that emphasize experiential learning in natural settings embody his understanding of wisdom gained through direct contact with the living world. Alternative health practices that honor the body's natural healing abilities and work with rather than against natural processes reflect principles that were central to his ancient healing practices. Even within traditional religious institutions, there are movements that echo aspects of Cernunnos' wisdom. Creation spirituality within Christianity emphasizes the sacred nature of the material world and the need for human beings to live in harmony with natural systems. Buddhist practitioners focusing on ecological dharma draw connections between traditional teachings about interdependence and contemporary understanding of ecological relationships. Progressive Islamic scholars explore how Quranic principles about stewardship of the earth relate to environmental protection and sustainable living. The digital age has created new opportunities for the ancient wisdom of Cernunnos to find expression and influence. Online communities dedicated to Celtic spirituality, paganism, and nature-based religions provide forums for sharing knowledge, experiences, and practices related to the horned god. Virtual reality technologies offer possibilities for creating immersive experiences of sacred groves and ancient ritual spaces that can provide meaningful spiritual encounters even for people living in urban environments. Environmental monitoring systems and ecological research networks reflect principles of interconnection and holistic awareness that are central to his worldview. As human consciousness continues to evolve and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, the ancient echo of Cernunnos serves as both a reminder of wisdom that should not be forgotten and a guide toward possibilities that have not yet been fully explored. His understanding of death and rebirth offers hope that current ecological and social crises may be transformative challenges rather than terminal disasters. His integration of wild and civilized aspects of existence suggests pathways toward forms of human culture that honor both creativity and natural law. His role as mediator between different levels of reality provides models for consciousness that can navigate between scientific and spiritual ways of knowing. As our journey through the mysteries of Cernunnos draws toward its close, we find ourselves not at an ending but at a beginning, for the wisdom of the horned god is not bound by the limitations of time or constrained by the boundaries of any single telling. Like the eternal cycles he embodies, his teaching continues to unfold in ever-expanding spirals of understanding, each revolution revealing deeper layers of meaning, each return bringing fresh insights that illuminate aspects previously hidden in shadow. The ancient Celts understood this principle of endless revelation, knowing that their gods were not static figures frozen in mythological amber, but living presences whose influence continued to evolve as human consciousness developed the capacity to receive more sophisticated levels of divine communication. Cernunnos exists now, as he always has, in the eternal present moment that transcends all temporal divisions. He is not a relic of the past, a museum piece to be studied and admired from the safe distance of scholarly detachment, but a vital and dynamic force that remains as relevant to contemporary seekers as he was to the Druids who once served him in sacred groves. His antlered crown still captures the light of consciousness seeking its true nature, his torques still represent the golden bonds that connect all beings in the web of existence. His serpent still symbolizes the Kundalini power that can transform ordinary awareness into divine realization. The eternal presence of Cernunnos manifests differently for each individual who opens their heart to receive his influence, for he is the God of infinite forms who appears to every seeker in the shape most appropriate to their current level of understanding and development. To the nature lover walking forest paths in meditation, he may manifest as the profound silence between bird calls, the quality of light that filters through leaves to create cathedral-like spaces of reverence and peace. To the artist struggling to give form to visions that exceed the capacity of ordinary language, he may appear as the sudden inspiration that bridges the gap between imagination and creation. To the environmentalist fighting to protect wild places from destruction, he may reveal himself as the fierce protectiveness that rises from depths of love too profound for rational explanation. In the realm of dreams and visions, where the conscious mind relaxes its control and allows deeper layers of awareness to surface, Cernunnos continues to appear to contemporary seekers with the same immediacy and power that he once brought to ancient Celtic dreamers. Modern people report encounters with antlered figures who guide them through symbolic landscapes that reveal solutions to personal challenges or insights into questions that have long troubled their waking minds. These visionary meetings often carry the quality of profound remembering, as though the dreamer were reconnecting with knowledge that had always been available but had been temporarily forgotten in the complexity of daily life. The eternal presence of Cernunnos also manifests in the spontaneous arising of ecological consciousness in individuals who have never encountered his mythology directly. The recognition that human welfare is inseparably connected to the health of natural ecosystems reflects his ancient teaching about the sacred relationship between consciousness and the living world. The intuitive understanding that sustainable human culture must be based on cooperation with rather than domination of natural forces echoes wisdom that he embodied thousands of years before the word sustainability entered common vocabulary. The growing awareness that true healing must address not only individual symptoms but the larger web of relationships in which every being exists parallels his holistic approach to medicine and spiritual development. In the field of psychology and consciousness research, principles that Cernunnos represented are being rediscovered and validated through scientific investigation. Studies of the healing effects of time spent in natural environments confirm his understanding of the therapeutic power of wild places. Research into the benefits of meditation and contemplative practices validates his teaching about the importance of stillness and inner listening. Investigation of shamanic and altered states of consciousness provides scientific frameworks for understanding the reality of the otherworldly journeys that were central to Celtic spiritual practice. The emerging field of ecopsychology specifically addresses the psychological consequences of disconnection from nature and explores therapeutic approaches that honor the bond between human consciousness and the natural world. The eternal presence of Cernunnos can be felt in the growing movement towards sacred activism, the understanding that spiritual development and social responsibility are not separate endeavors but complementary aspects of conscious evolution. Environmental activists who approach their work as a form of spiritual practice are embodying his integration of inner transformation and outer service. Healers who address not only individual clients but the larger systems and communities in which healing must ultimately occur are following pathways that he pioneered in ancient times. Teachers who help students develop both intellectual knowledge and intuitive wisdom are honoring his role as the divine pedagogue who educated through direct transmission of understanding rather than mere accumulation of information. In the realm of relationships and sexuality, modern explorations of sacred intimacy and conscious partnership reflect principles that Cernunnos embodied in his aspect as the fertility god who blessed unions that served the greater good of creation. Contemporary understanding of tantric practices that use sexual energy for spiritual transformation echoes ancient Celtic recognition of the creative force as a pathway to divine consciousness. The growing awareness that authentic masculinity must integrate both strength and sensitivity, both leadership and receptivity, parallels his demonstration of masculine divinity that included qualities traditionally associated with both genders. The eternal presence of Cernunnos in contemporary culture can also be recognized in the revival of interest in traditional crafts and skills that connect people directly to natural materials and processes. Woodworking, metalsmithing, pottery, weaving, and other hands-on arts provide opportunities for the kind of meditative engagement with natural substances that was central to Celtic spiritual practice. The growing popularity of gardening, especially organic and permaculture approaches that work with natural systems rather than against them, reflects his understanding of agriculture as a form of cooperation with divine intelligence manifested in the earth. Herbal medicine, wildcrafting, and other practices that involve direct relationship with plant consciousness echo the botanical wisdom that Druids received through communion with him. Even in the world of modern technology, there are applications and developments that reflect principles associated with Cernunnos. Biomimicry, the practice of studying natural systems to inspire technological innovations, embodies his teaching that human creativity achieves its highest expression when it learns from and cooperates with the intelligence already present in nature. Renewable energy technologies that harness natural forces like wind and solar power reflect understanding of the inexhaustible creative energy that he represented. Computer systems designed to operate according to organic principles of growth and adaptation rather than rigid mechanical programming echo his integration of order and spontaneity, structure and freedom. The eternal presence of Cernunnos is perhaps most clearly felt in those moments when ordinary consciousness suddenly opens to reveal the sacred dimension that pervades all existence. These breakthrough experiences, whether they occur during formal meditation, spontaneous encounters with natural beauty, or profound experiences of love and connection with other beings, carry the quality of recognition that characterized ancient Celtic encounters with divine presence. In such moments, the veil between worlds grows thin, and we glimpse the living intelligence that animates all phenomena, the consciousness that looks out through every pair of eyes and breathes through every pair of lungs. For those who have developed the sensitivity to perceive his presence, Cernunnos continues to serve the same functions in contemporary times that he fulfilled for ancient Celtic peoples. He remains the guide who can lead consciousness through the dark passages of transformation, the teacher who reveals wisdom that cannot be learned through books or lectures, the healer whose medicine addresses the deepest causes of suffering rather than merely its surface symptoms. He continues to challenge the boundaries and limitations that societies create to maintain order and control, calling individuals toward greater authenticity and more complete expression of their divine nature. He still offers protection and guidance to those who venture into unknown territories of consciousness, whether through meditation, vision questing, or other practices that explore the farther reaches of human potential. The eternal presence of Cernunnos assures us that the ancient wisdom traditions need not remain locked in the past, accessible only through historical study and archaeological reconstruction. Living wisdom is always available to those who approach it with proper preparation and genuine devotion, regardless of the cultural forms through which it was originally transmitted. The gods who were real to our ancestors remain real today, though they may choose to manifest through contemporary symbols and speak through modern languages. The mysteries that transformed human consciousness in ancient times retain their power to catalyze spiritual development in seekers who are willing to undertake the necessary preparation and surrender. As we prepare to complete this exploration of Cernunnos and his enduring influence on human consciousness, we do so with the understanding that what we have shared represents only a small portion of the vast mystery that he embodies. Like a sacred grove that reveals different aspects of its beauty depending on the season when it is visited, the light that illuminates it, and the consciousness that perceives it, the horned god continues to offer new teachings to each generation of seekers who approach him with open hearts and humble minds. His antlered crown remains a beacon for consciousness seeking its true home, his eternal presence a reminder that the sacred has never been absent from the world but only temporarily forgotten by minds too busy with surface concerns to perceive the divine mystery that underlies all appearance. The eternal presence of Cernunnos lives within every breath we take, every heartbeat that sustains our earthly journey, every moment of wonder that opens us to the beauty and mystery of existence. He walks beside us on city streets as surely as he once moved through ancient forests, offers his wisdom through traffic sounds as clearly as through wind in sacred groves, reveals his teaching in the faces of strangers as unmistakably as in the eyes of wild deer. For those who have learned to see with the inner sight that he develops in his devoted students, the world is permanently enchanted, every experience a potential gateway to deeper understanding, every encounter an opportunity to touch the living presence of divinity that animates all creation. And so the horned god continues his eternal dance of death and rebirth, leading consciousness through endless cycles of transformation, forever demonstrating that what appears to end is always the beginning of something greater, that what seems to be lost is always restored in more beautiful form, that the love which seeks expression through every conscious being is stronger than any force that would diminish or destroy it. His presence is our assurance that consciousness itself is indestructible, that the journey of awakening continues through every apparent ending, and that the divine nature which is our deepest identity will ultimately be recognized and embodied by every being capable of receiving such magnificent grace. And now, as the ancient stories settle into the deeper chambers of your consciousness like seeds finding fertile soil in which to germinate, feel yourself returning slowly to this present moment, carrying with you the wisdom of ages past and the promise of revelations yet to come. The antlered crown of Cernunnos continues to cast its shadow across your inner landscape, marking you as one who has walked the forest paths of mystery and returned with treasures that cannot be stolen or lost. Let your breathing deepen now, each inhalation drawing you back toward waking consciousness while preserving the sacred memories of your journey through realms where gods walk among mortals and every tree holds the potential for divine encounter. Feel the solid earth beneath your body, welcoming you home from your travels through the otherworld, yet know that you carry within yourself forever a piece of that sacred realm where Cernunnos holds his eternal court. As you prepare to return fully to ordinary awareness, Remember that the horned god does not dwell only in ancient stories or distant memories, but lives within your own heart as the wild wisdom that knows no boundaries, the creative force that seeks expression through your unique gifts and talents, the eternal presence that connects you to all life. His teaching continues in the whisper of wind through whatever trees grow near your dwelling place, in the cycles of moon and season that turn regardless of human plans and schedules, in every moment when wonder breaks through the routines of daily life to remind you of the sacred nature of existence itself. Sleep now, if sleep calls to you, knowing that dreams may bring further revelations from the realm where Cernunnos keeps his vigil. Or wake gently if waking is your path, carrying with you the blessing of the horned god and the knowledge that you are never truly alone, for consciousness itself is the eternal companion that walks beside you through every adventure of awakening. The ancient stories live on in you now, not as distant memories but as present realities, seeds of transformation that will unfold in perfect timing to guide you toward ever greater expressions of your divine nature. Rest well, journey on, and remember always that the sacred mystery of existence celebrates itself through your very being, and the gods rejoice in every step you take toward the full realization of who and what you truly are. May the wisdom of Cernunnos illuminate your path, may his protection surround you always, and may his eternal presence remind you that you are loved beyond measure and blessed beyond imagining. Sleep peacefully now, beloved traveler, for the sacred grove is always within you, and the horned god keeps watch through all the seasons of your soul's magnificent journey home. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.